The Arizona sun hung mercilessly in the sky, pouring heat like molten iron upon the cracked earth below. It was 1875, and in this unforgiving landscape where shadows shrank to nothing at midday, the line between survival and solitude often blurred into one. A single gunshot cracked the heavy silence, echoing off distant mesas before dissolving into the shimmering heat. Mason Riley ducked behind a weather-beaten boulder, the worn leather of his holster creaking as he drew his revolver. At 63, his movements weren't as fluid as they once had been, but decades of experience had made them deliberate, efficient. He thumbed back the hammer with practiced ease. "That's close enough," he shouted, his voice rough from thirst and trail dust. "I'm carrying nothing worth dying for." A lie, of course. The leather satchel pressed against his side contained something worth more than gold to Mason, a neatly folded document bearing the territorial governor's seal. A pardon for his son, a chance to right a terrible wrong. Another shot splintered rock inches from his head, sending fragments dancing across his weathered face. Mason grimaced, feeling a sharp sting as one sliced his cheek. Blood trickled warm down his jawline, mingling with sweat, before dropping onto his faded blue shirt. "Hand over your valuables, old man." The voice came from the left, young and hungry. "We know you're carrying something important." Mason's heart thumped painfully against his ribs. How could they know he'd told no one about the pardon except the lawyer in Tucson? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves shifting nervously behind him. Copper, his faithful chestnut gelding, was growing restless. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, his nostrils flaring with each breath. Mason had ridden Copper through the last days of the war, and in the decades since the animal had become more than transportation, he was family. The only family Mason had left outside prison walls. "Easy, boy," Mason whispered. "We've faced worse than desert trash." 3 riders, Mason calculated based on the voices and hoof patterns. Not impossible odds, but not favorable either, especially not when he was 2 days out from Fort Benson with barely enough water to make it. He couldn't afford a prolonged standoff. "Last chance, Grandpa," another voice harder than the first. "Or we start shooting the horse." Mason felt ice replace the blood in his veins. He'd sooner die himself than see Copper shot. The animal sensed his tension, giving a low, worried nicker. Mason took a deep breath, tasting dust and sage on his tongue. He'd spent 30 years as a cavalryman, then as a dispatch rider. He knew how to make quick decisions when lives hung in the balance. "I'm coming out," he called, keeping his voice steady. "Don't shoot the horse." He emerged slowly from behind the boulder, hands raised, revolver dangling from his trigger finger. The sun struck him full in the face, momentarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, he saw them, 3 young men on scraggly horses' bandanas, pulled up over their noses, eyes bright with the particular cruelty of youth. The leader, a tall man on a spotted horse, gestured with his rifle. "The satchel! Toss it over!" Mason felt the weight of the pardon against his hip. 5 days. He had 5 days to reach Fort Benson before Elliott faced the noose. 5 days to deliver the document that would free his only son from a crime he didn't commit. "It's just papers," Mason said, trying to sound dismissive. "Nothing valuable." "We'll be the judge of that," the leader sneered. Now, Mason's mind raced. The moment he surrendered the satchel, he and Copper would be dead. These weren't the type to leave witnesses. His gaze darted between the 3 men, noting their positions, the way they held their weapons, calculating odds and angles. In one fluid movement that belied his age, Mason dropped to one knee, raised his revolver, and fired. The leader's hat flew off as he tumbled backward from his saddle. Before the others could react, Mason rolled behind a scrub oak, squeezing off another shot that sent the second rider clutching his arm, cursing. The third bandit fired wildly, bullets kicking up dust around Mason's position. Mason heard Copper whinny in alarm, followed by a terrible sound he'd hoped never to hear again, the pained scream of a horse in agony. "Copper!" he shouted, breaking cover to see his faithful companion rearing in pain, blood streaming down his front leg where a bullet had struck. The momentary distraction nearly cost Mason his life. A bullet whizzed past his ear close enough that he felt its heat. Instinct took over. He spun and fired twice. The third bandit slumped in his saddle, then toppled to the ground. The remaining outlaw took one look at his fallen companions, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the still air like a dirty shroud. Mason didn't waste time watching him flee. He rushed to Copper, his heart constricting at the sight of the wound. The bullet had torn through the muscle of the gelding's right foreleg, missing bone, but leaving a deep, angry gash that pulsed with bright arterial blood. "Easy, boy," Mason murmured, running a calloused hand along the horse's sweating neck. "Easy now." He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it tightly around the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Copper trembled beneath his touch eyes, rolling white with pain and fear. Mason surveyed their situation with growing dread. They were at least 40 miles from Fort Benson, in the harshest stretch of desert between Tucson and the fort. His canteen was half empty. The sun would remain merciless for hours yet. And now, Copper could barely put weight on his injured leg. "We've got to move," Mason told the horse, as if the animal could understand the gravity of their situation. "Elliot's counting on us." Elliot. The name sent a fresh wave of urgency through Mason's tired body. His son, 32 years old, and scheduled to hang in 5 days for a murder he didn't commit. 2 years of legal battles selling the family ranch to pay lawyers, and finally securing a pardon based on new evidence. All of it would be meaningless if Mason couldn't deliver that document to Fort Benson in time. He guided Copper forward, grimacing as the horse limped painfully. Each step seemed to cost the animal tremendous effort. Mason walked beside him, one hand on the reins, the other ready to support Copper if his leg gave out. "Just a little further," he encouraged, though he had no destination in mind beyond putting distance between themselves and the site of the ambush. "We'll find some shade and look at that leg properly." The desert stretched around them, indifferent to their plight. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms reaching skyward in mute supplication. The mountains on the horizon wavered in the heat, appearing both impossibly close and unreachably far. An hour passed in grueling slowness. Copper's limp worsened. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with blood, and Mason could see the horse was weakening. His own shirt clung to his back, drenched with sweat. The cut on his cheek had stopped bleeding, but stung fiercely in the salt of his perspiration. When they finally reached a small outcropping of rock that offered some shelter from the sun, Mason felt a momentary relief so profound it made his knees weak. He guided Copper into the meager shade and carefully removed the blood-soaked bandage. What he saw made his stomach clench. The wound was swollen, the edges already showing signs of infection in the merciless heat. Desert dust had worked its way into the torn flesh despite his efforts to keep it clean. Copper's leg trembled continuously now, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. Mason uncorked his canteen and poured a small amount of precious water over the wound, trying to clean it. Copper flinched at the contact but stood stoically, as he had through artillery fire and cavalry charges years ago. "You're a good boy," Mason said softly, rebandaging the leg with the cleanest part of his bandana. "The best I've ever known." He offered Copper water from his cupped palm, rationing carefully. The gelding drank thirstily, his usually bright eyes dulled with pain. Mason took a single swallow himself, the warm liquid barely easing the dryness of his throat. As the afternoon wore on, Mason's concern deepened. Copper's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The horse now refused to put any weight on the injured leg, and the swelling had spread upward toward the knee. Worse, a faint tremor had begun to run through the animal's entire body, the beginning of shock. Mason had seen horses die from wounds less severe when infection took hold in the unforgiving conditions of the trail. He'd put those animals out of their misery with a bullet, a final act of mercy from a soldier who understood suffering. The thought of doing the same to Copper was unbearable. Night was approaching, bringing the promise of cooler air, but also the chill that could prove dangerous to an injured animal. Mason gathered what scraps of vegetation he could find to build a small fire, more for Copper's comfort than his own. As darkness fell, Mason sat beside his horse, one hand resting on the animal's neck, feeling each labored breath. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the pardon, the paper crackling in the stillness. By firelight, he read again the formal language that would save his son's life. By the authority vested in me as governor of the Arizona Territory, I hereby grant full pardon to Elliot James Riley, convicted of the murder of Anna Whitefeather. Mason folded the document carefully and returned it to his satchel. Elliot had maintained his innocence from the beginning. He hadn't killed the Navajo girl. He'd been framed by Captain James Harrington, a man whose corruption ran deep in the territorial forces. It had taken 2 years to gather enough evidence to prove it, 2 years of Elliot waiting in a cell while Mason exhausted every resource the family had. And now, when salvation was finally within reach, Mason found himself stranded in the desert with an injured horse and a deadline that couldn't be moved. "What am I going to do, Copper?" he whispered, leaning his forehead against the horse's warm neck. "I can't leave you. I can't fail Elliot. God help me, I don't know what to do." But for the first time since he'd held his wife's hand as she succumbed to fever 15 years ago, Mason Riley felt tears burn in his eyes. He was too old to make the journey on foot in time, too stubborn to abandon the horse who'd been his only companion for a decade, too heartbroken at the thought of failing his son again. The first sob surprised him, tearing from his throat like it belonged to someone else. Once it started, he couldn't stop. Years of stoic endurance crumbled in the face of this impossible choice. He wept openly, his tears dampening Copper's mane, his body shaking with grief too long contained. "Don't you leave me," he pleaded with the horse, his voice breaking. "And don't make me leave you either. We've come too far together, you and I." Copper nickered softly in response, as if trying to comfort his master despite his own pain. The sound only made Mason's tears flow more freely. "I promised Ellen before she died that I'd take care of our boy," Mason whispered. "I promised. And I promised you after the war that I'd never abandon you. How can a man choose between his promises?" The desert offered no answer. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward to join the vast field of stars now visible overhead. In the distance, a coyote called its lonely cry, echoing Mason's own desolation. As the night deepened, Copper's condition worsened. The tremors increased, and a terrible heat radiated from the wound. Mason bathed the horse's leg with the last of his water, but the swelling continued to spread. By midnight, Copper had collapsed onto his side, his great body shuddering with each breath. Mason sat beside him, one hand stroking the horse's neck, the other clutching the satchel that held his son's freedom. He'd faced death many times in his long life on battlefields, in skirmishes with hostile tribes during the harsh winters when food was scarce. But never had he felt so utterly helpless, caught between two impossible choices. "I can't lose you both," he told Copper, his voice raw. "I just can't." As dawn approached, bringing with it a brief respite from the desert heat, Mason made a decision. He would wait until first light. If Copper showed any sign of improvement, they would continue together no matter how slowly. If not, Mason couldn't finish the thought. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Mason heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to the desert night. Footsteps. Human footsteps approaching steadily. He reached for his revolver, movements stiff from hours of sitting vigil. "Who's there?" he called, voice cracking from thirst and emotion. "Show yourself." From the pre-dawn shadows emerged a figure that seemed almost to materialize from the desert itself. An elderly woman, her face deeply lined like the arroyos that cut through the landscape. Her silver hair was braided with strands of turquoise and bone that caught the first light of day. She wore a simple dress of deerskin, adorned with intricate beadwork, in patterns Mason recognized as Navajo. Across her chest hung a leather bag bulging with unknown contents. In one hand she carried a staff topped with feathers and small animal bones. She moved with surprising grace for one so clearly advanced in years, her moccasined feet barely disturbing the sandy soil. Mason kept his revolver trained on her, though his instincts told him she posed no threat. "What do you want?" he demanded, too exhausted for courtesy. The woman stopped several paces away, her dark eyes taking in the scene, the injured horse, the blood-stained bandages, the desperate man with tears dried on his weathered cheeks. "I have been following you," she said, her voice carrying the cadence of her native tongue, though she spoke in clear accented English. "Since yesterday. I felt your sorrow on the wind." Mason frowned, confusion momentarily replacing his wariness. "Following me, why?" "I am Juanita," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "Last shaman of my people in this valley." She gestured toward Copper. "Your four-legged brother is dying." The blunt statement hit Mason like a physical blow. He lowered his gun slightly, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "I know," he admitted. "He was shot. I can't stop the infection." Juanita nodded, her expression neither pitying nor judging. "I have medicines that might help him, but first you must show me what you carry in that bag you hold so tightly." Mason's grip reflexively tightened on the satchel. "This doesn't concern you." "It does," she countered calmly. "Everything in the desert concerns those who know how to listen. Your horse is suffering. You are suffering, and someone else's fate weighs on you like a stone." She took another step closer, her gaze penetrating. "I can help your horse, but you must trust me with your burden first." Mason hesitated. The pardon was too important to risk. Yet Copper was slipping away before his eyes, and something in the old woman's steady gaze spoke of wisdom, of understanding beyond her simple appearance. "You say you can help him?" Mason asked, a fragile hope flickering to life. "How?" "I have ways," she answered. "Medicines from plants that know how to fight poison in the blood. But healing requires truth between us. Show me what you protect so fiercely." Dawn was breaking fully now, painting the desert in soft gold and rose. Copper's breathing had grown more labored, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a whispered plea for release. Mason knew he was running out of time for the horse, for his son, for himself. With hands that trembled slightly, he opened the satchel and withdrew the pardon. "It's for my son," he said, voice rough with emotion. "He's in Fort Benson, scheduled to hang in 5 days for a murder he didn't commit. This paper will save his life if I can deliver it in time." Juanita stepped forward and took the document, her fingers surprisingly gentle as they unfolded the heavy paper. Though Mason wasn't sure she could read, she studied it carefully, her weathered face revealing nothing. "Murder," she repeated softly. Who was killed? A young Navajo woman, Mason answered, watching her face closely. Name of Anna Whitefeather. Juanita's expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of her eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. She handed the pardon back to Mason. "Do you know why your son was accused of this murder?" she asked. Mason frowned. "He was framed by a corrupt officer, a man named Captain Harrington, who's since been exposed for other crimes." "And you believe your son is innocent?" "I know he is," Mason said firmly. "Elliot wouldn't hurt anyone, especially not a young woman." Juanita regarded him silently for a long moment, as if weighing his words against some hidden measure. Finally, she nodded once, decision made. "I will help your horse," she said. "But healing takes time and truth. Both will be needed here." Without waiting for his response, she moved to Copper's side and knelt beside the stricken animal. From her leather bag, she began to withdraw various items: bundles of dried herbs, small pouches of powder, a clay jar sealed with beeswax. Mason watched as she worked, her movements deliberate and sure. She crushed herbs between smooth river stones, mixed powders, with a small amount of water from a skin bag he hadn't noticed before, all the while murmuring words in her native tongue that sounded half prayer, half instruction. "What are you doing?" Mason asked, hovering nearby, torn between hope and skepticism. "Preparing medicine," Juanita replied without looking up. "This is juniper, to fight the poison sage, to purify yucca root, to draw out the bad spirits." She worked the mixture into a paste, adding drops of amber liquid from the clay jar. The pungent smell filled the small shelter sharp and medicinal. When she was satisfied with the consistency, she moved to Copper's injured leg. With gentle but firm hands, she removed Mason's makeshift bandage. The wound beneath was angry and swollen, seeping fluid that spoke of deep infection. Mason winced at the sight, but Juanita remained calm, assessing the damage with clinical detachment. "Hold him steady," she instructed. "This will cause pain before it brings healing." Mason positioned himself at Copper's head, stroking the horse's neck and murmuring reassurances. Juanita applied the paste directly to the wound, pressing it deep into the injured flesh. Copper jerked violently, a shrill whinny of pain escaping him. Mason held firm, continuing his stream of soothing words. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "Easy now. Let her help you." Juanita worked methodically, covering the entire wound with her medicine. When she was done, she wrapped the leg with strips of clean cloth she produced from her bag, binding the poultice in place. "Now we wait," she said, sitting back on her heels. "And while we wait, you will tell me more about this son you are trying to save." Mason hesitated, private by nature and unaccustomed to sharing his troubles with strangers. But something about Juanita's direct gaze made evasion seem both impossible and unnecessary. Besides, she was helping Copper when he had lost all hope. He owed her at least the courtesy of honest conversation. "Elliot is my only child," he began, settling himself beside Copper's head, one hand still resting protectively on the horse's neck. 32 years old now, his mother Ellen died when he was 17. Fever took her one hard winter. After that, it was just the two of us on our ranch outside Tucson. Juanita listened silently, her hands busy preparing another mixture of herbs, this one more aromatic than medicinal. "He's a good boy," Mason continued. "Smart, kind. Wanted to be a doctor, was saving to go east for schooling. Then, 2 years ago, he was arrested for killing this Navajo girl, Anna Whitefeather." Something in Juanita's expression made Mason pause. "Did you know her?" "Anna was my granddaughter," Juanita said simply, the words dropping between them like stones into still water. Mason felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Your granddaughter?" Juanita nodded, her hands never pausing in their work. "She was found dead near the fort, strangled. Your son's knife beside her body. It was planted there, Mason said quickly, defensively. Elliot never met your granddaughter, let alone harmed her. It was Captain Harrington who killed her. We have proof now. A witness came forward, a private who saw Harrington leaving the scene. And this is why you have the pardon, Juanita said. It wasn't a question. Yes, the governor reviewed the new evidence, ordered Elliot's immediate release. But the Fort Commander Harrington's friend is dragging his feet. Says he needs the official document before he can release my son. Mason's fists clenched at the memory of the commander's smug face. It's a delaying tactic. They're hoping to hang Elliot before the pardon arrives. That's why I have to get there in time. Juanita had finished preparing her second mixture. She set it in a small clay bowl and lit it with an ember from the fire. It began to smolder, releasing a sweet, pungent smoke that she wafted over Copper's body with a fan of feathers. "So you believe this captain killed my granddaughter," she said, her tone neutral. "Why would he do this?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. The investigation uncovered that he was stealing from the army, selling supplies meant for the fort, taking bribes from settlers for protection. Anna must have seen something or known something. He silenced her, then framed my son, because Elliot had argued with him publicly about the treatment of Navajo prisoners. "You know much about this captain's crimes," Juanita observed, "but little about Anna herself." There was no accusation in her voice, but Mason felt a prickle of shame nonetheless. It was true, in his 2-year fight to free Elliot, he had thought little about the victim beyond her usefulness to the case. She had been a name, a reason for his son's imprisonment, not a person with a life and family of her own. "I'm sorry for your loss." He said the words, inadequate but sincere. No one deserved what happened to her. Juanita acknowledged his condolence with a slight nod. Anna was 19 summers. She worked at the fort, cleaning for the officers' wives. She was learning to read. She wanted to become a teacher for our children. The simple details humanized the girl in a way Mason hadn't considered before. He tried to imagine how he would feel if it had been Elliot murdered and a Navajo father fighting to free his wrongfully accused son. Would he have shown the same composure Juanita displayed now? "Do you know why I followed you?" Juanita asked, interrupting his thoughts. Mason shook his head. "I felt your grief," she said. "It called to me across the desert like a voice. Not just for your horse, but deeper. The grief of a father who fears failing his child." She passed the smoking bowl under Copper's nostrils. The horse inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a soft sigh that seemed to release some of the tension in his body. "I know this grief," she continued. "I have carried it since they brought Anna's body back to our camp, a grandmother who could not protect her granddaughter." Mason was struck by the parallel between them two elders carrying the weight of their failure to shield the young from harm. Despite the vast differences in their lives and cultures, this fundamental pain united them. "Can you save him?" Mason asked, nodding toward Copper. "Be honest with me." Juanita set the smoking bowl down and placed her palm on Copper's injured leg. The swelling seemed less angry now, though Mason couldn't be sure if that was due to her ministrations or merely wishful thinking. "The medicine is working," she said. "But healing is not just in plants and smoke. It is in the spirit also. Your horse has fought many battles for you. He needs a reason to fight this one." She fixed Mason with a penetrating gaze. "Tell me, Mason Riley, what is the true reason your son was in that place where Anna died? What brought him to the fort that day?" Mason frowned, taken aback by the question. "I told you he was framed." "No," Juanita interrupted gently but firmly. "Not why he was accused. Why he was there. You have not asked yourself this question, I think." Mason opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. She was right. In his determination to prove Elliot's innocence, he had never questioned why his son had been near the fort that day. Elliot had been vague on this point during the trial, saying only that he had business in the area. "I don't know," Mason admitted, the realization unsettling him. "He never said, and I never asked. I assumed it was related to his work. He sometimes delivered supplies to the settlements near the fort." Juanita nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she already knew. "Your horse is resting now. The medicine will work through him as the sun crosses the sky. While we wait, I will tell you about Anna, and perhaps then you will understand more about your son." She settled herself more comfortably on the ground, her back straight despite her years. The rising sun cast her weathered face in gold, highlighting the deep lines that mapped a lifetime of hardship and wisdom. "Anna was not like other girls of our tribe." She began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. From the time she could walk, she asked questions. Why is the sky blue? Why does the yucca bloom after rain? Why must our people live apart from the white settlers? Mason found himself drawn into her narrative despite his concern for copper and his urgency to reach Fort Benson. There was something hypnotic about Juanita's voice, something that seemed to slow time itself. "When she was 16, Juanita continued, I took her to the fort with me to sell baskets. An officer's wife saw how quick Anna was to learn. She offered her work and permission to use their books. Anna accepted, though many in our tribe disapproved." She paused, gazing into the distance, as if seeing the past unfold before her. 2 seasons ago, Anna changed. She became secretive. She smiled more but spoke less. She would disappear for hours and return with her eyes shining like stars. A knowing look passed across Juanita's face. An old woman knows these signs. A young heart had found love. Mason shifted uncomfortably. A suspicion was forming in his mind, one he wasn't sure he wanted confirmed. "One night, Anna came to me," Juanita said. "She told me she had met a white man who was different from the others, a man who spoke to her with respect, who listened when she talked, who shared his dreams with her. A man who wanted to marry her, though such unions are forbidden by both our peoples." Mason's heart began to pound. "This man," he said hoarsely. Did she tell you his name?" Juanita's gaze returned to him, sharp and assessing. "She called him Eli. She said he was the son of a rancher, that his father would not approve, but they would find a way to be together." Eli, Elliot's childhood nickname, one that few outside the family ever used. Mason's mind reeled with the implications. His son and this Navajo girl in love, planning to marry. It seemed impossible, yet a cold certainty was settling in his gut. "That can't be right," he said, the denial automatic. "Elliot never mentioned. He would have told me if—" But even as he spoke, Mason remembered his son's unusual behavior in the months before the arrest. The unexplained absences from the ranch, the secretive smiles, the books on Navajo culture that had appeared on his shelf. "Your son never told you about Anna." Juanita said not a question but a statement. "Just as Anna never told me the full name of her Eli. Both knew the world would try to keep them apart." Mason felt as though the ground beneath him had dropped away. If what Juanita said was true, it changed everything. Not Elliot's innocence, Mason still believed absolutely in that, but the context of the crime, the reason his son had been such a convenient scapegoat. "If they were involved," Mason said, struggling with the concept, "then why would Harrington think he could frame Elliot for her murder? Surely he'd know Elliot would have an alibi witnesses who had seen them together. Their love was secret, Juanita reminded him, and perhaps this captain knew more than either of them realized. Perhaps he saw an opportunity in their forbidden meetings. She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes intent on Mason's face. "What would you have done, Mason Riley, if your son had told you he loved a Navajo girl, that he wished to marry her? Would you have given your blessing?" The question hit Mason like a physical blow. He wanted to say yes, to claim he would have supported his son's happiness, regardless of who brought it. But he knew himself too well to maintain such a comfortable fiction. "I don't know," he admitted, the words painful in his throat. "I'd like to think I would have understood, but—" "But our peoples have been enemies more often than friends," Juanita finished for him. "And old prejudices die slowly, like coal embers that seem cold on the surface but burn hot underneath." Mason couldn't deny it. He had fought against Navajo raiders in his younger days, had lost friends to their attacks. He had never considered himself a hateful man, but the idea of his only son marrying a native woman would have troubled him deeply. "Is that why he didn't tell me?" Mason wondered aloud, a new grief washing over him. "Did he think I wouldn't accept them?" "Children see more than we think," Juanita said gently. "They hear the words we do not say. They feel the judgments we try to hide." Copper stirred beside them, letting out a soft nicker. Mason automatically reached out to stroke the horse's neck, taking comfort in the familiar texture of the coarse mane beneath his fingers. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then Elliot had even more reason to be near the fort that day. He was meeting Anna." Juanita nodded. "This is what I believe, and it is why your captain chose him as the one to blame. Who better than a man already connected to the victim, but in a way neither would publicly admit?" The sun was climbing higher now, the brief mercy of early morning giving way to the full heat of day. Mason felt sweat begin to trickle down his back, but the discomfort was distant, overshadowed by the revelations Juanita had brought. "There is more," Juanita said after a moment, her voice dropping lower, as if the words themselves were heavy. "Something even Anna did not tell me, until the end was near." Mason looked up sharply. "What do you mean, the end? I thought she was killed at the fort." Juanita shook her head slowly. "Anna did not die immediately. She was found by children from our tribe, still breathing, but badly hurt. They brought her to me. I tried to save her with my medicines, but her injuries were too severe. She lived long enough to speak a few words." Mason felt a chill despite the desert heat. "What did she say?" "She said, 'Tell Eli I'm sorry. Tell him about the baby.'" Juanita's eyes never left Mason's face as she delivered this final revelation. "My granddaughter was carrying your son's child when she died." The words hung in the air between them, irrevocable and transformative. Mason stared at Juanita, unable to speak, unable even to form a coherent thought. A grandchild. Elliot was to be a father. He, Mason, would have been a grandfather. All of it lost in a single act of violence. "No," he whispered finally. "That can't be. Elliot would have told me if—" But even as he spoke, Mason knew his son might well have kept this secret too, for all the same reasons he had hidden the relationship itself. "Anna was certain," Juanita said. 2 moons had passed since her bleeding time. She was preparing to tell your son when she died." Mason's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, grief for the future, that would never be anger at Elliot for keeping such secrets, pain at the thought that his own son had not trusted him enough to share his joy and his love. "All this time," he said, his voice hollow, 2 years fighting to free him, and I never knew what he had truly lost." Juanita reached out and laid a weathered hand on his arm, the first physical contact between them. Her touch was surprisingly warm, steady. "Now you understand why I followed you," she said. "Why I felt drawn to your grief. It echoes my own. We have both lost more than others can see." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He glanced at Copper, finding a strange comfort in the horse's presence, in the steady rise and fall of his rib cage. At least here was one loss he might be spared. "Your medicine," he said finally. "It seems to be helping him." Juanita withdrew her hand and turned her attention to Copper. She examined the bandaged leg carefully, her fingers gentle but thorough. "The swelling lessens," she confirmed. "The poison is being drawn out, but he is still weak. He needs more time to heal before he can carry you." Mason's brief moment of relief was overshadowed by renewed anxiety. "Time is what I don't have," he said. 4 days now until Elliot—" He couldn't finish the sentence. 4 days to Fort Benson," Juanita mused. "On a healthy horse, 2 days' ride. On foot, 4 days at least if you travel day and night without rest." "Impossible," Mason muttered. "At my age in this heat, and I can't leave Copper." "No," Juanita agreed. "One does not abandon family." She rose to her feet in a single fluid movement that belied her years. "I must gather more medicine for your horse. The first treatment has started the healing, but more will be needed to complete it." "Wait," Mason called as she turned to leave. "You haven't told me everything. What happened to the baby? Did it die with Anna?" Juanita paused her back to him. For a long moment she was silent, so still she might have been carved from the red stone that surrounded them. "Some truths must be earned," she said finally without turning around. "Care for your horse? I will return when the sun begins its descent." Before Mason could press further, she walked away, her figure quickly swallowed by the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. He was left alone with Copper, the pardon, and a host of new questions that troubled his soul more deeply than he could have imagined possible. The day stretched endlessly. Mason tended to Copper, offering small amounts of water, speaking softly to the horse as he had done through countless watches and marches over their years together. The gelding seemed marginally better. His breathing was steadier, and the terrible heat had subsided from the wounded leg. But he was still far too weak to travel, let alone carry a rider. As promised, Juanita returned when the sun hung low in the western sky. She carried a bundle of fresh plants, their sharp medicinal scent cutting through the dry desert air. Without preamble, she knelt beside Copper and began preparing a new poultice. "How is he?" she asked, though her experienced eyes were already assessing the horse's condition. "Better, I think," Mason replied. "He took water earlier, tried to stand once." Juanita nodded her fingers, working deftly to crush leaves and stems between smooth stones. "Good signs. His spirit is strong, like his master's." Mason watched her work, questions burning in his mind, but unsure how to voice them. Finally, he said simply, "Why are you helping us?" Juanita continued her preparations without looking up. "I told you. Your grief called to me." "There's more," Mason insisted. "You know things about my son, about Anna, that go beyond what a grandmother would know. You followed me for a reason." Juanita's hands paused briefly, then resumed their rhythmic grinding. "Yes," she acknowledged. "There is more." She finished preparing the medicine and moved to remove Copper's bandage. The wound looked markedly better, the angry redness had faded, and the swelling had reduced significantly. She applied the fresh poultice with gentle efficiency, rewrapping the leg with clean strips of cloth. Only when she had completed this task did she settle back and meet Mason's questioning gaze. "What I tell you now," she said, her voice low and measured, "I tell you because you have earned it through your own truth, and because soon you must make a choice that will affect many lives." Mason felt a chill run down his spine despite the lingering heat of the day. What choice? Juanita looked past him toward the mountains that glowed red gold in the setting sun. When Anna died, she left behind more than grief. The child she carried did not die with her. Mason stared at her, uncomprehending. At first, then, with dawning astonishment. "What are you saying? That's not possible. If she was injured badly enough to die—" "She lived for 3 days after she was found," Juanita explained. "Long enough for the women of our tribe to recognize what was happening. Her body was preparing to release the child too early for it to live. But our oldest midwife used knowledge passed down through generations. She performed a cutting, took the baby from Anna's body after her spirit had departed." Mason's mind struggled to grasp what Juanita was telling him. "A cutting, you mean?" "The midwife cut the baby from—" He couldn't complete the gruesome image. Juanita nodded solemnly. "It is rarely done and dangerous. But the midwife believed the child deserved a chance at life, as did Anna." "And the baby survived this?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A girl," Juanita said, a softness entering her voice for the first time. "Small too early, but strong. We called her Dawn, for she came into the world as the sun rose on the day after her mother's passing." Mason felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath him for the second time that day. A granddaughter, alive. Elliot's child, living among the Navajo. The implications were staggering. "Where is she now?" he managed to ask through the shock. "With my sister's family," Juanita replied. "She is 2 summers old now. She has her mother's eyes and her father's smile. 2 years old, walking, talking, developing her own personality, while her father sat in a cell awaiting execution for a crime he didn't commit, while her grandfather fought to free him, never knowing she existed." "Does Elliot know?" Mason asked, though he already suspected the answer. "No," Juanita confirmed. "No one outside our tribe knows of her existence. It was decided that she would be safer if the white world remained ignorant of her." "Safer from what?" Mason demanded, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed flaring to life. "From the man who killed her mother," Juanita said simply, "the man you call Captain Harrington." Understanding dawned on Mason with terrible clarity. "He knew," he breathed, "about the baby. That's why he killed Anna. Not because she saw him stealing, but because she was carrying a half-white child, Elliot's child." Juanita nodded grimly. "Anna told her friend, another girl who worked at the fort, about the baby. This friend was close with the captain. We believe she told him, perhaps innocently, not knowing his hatred. And Harrington couldn't stand the thought of a white man's child being born to a Navajo woman," Mason concluded, disgust rising in his throat. "So he killed her and framed Elliot for the murder." "He tried to erase them both," Juanita agreed. "The mother and the child. He did not succeed." Mason's mind raced with the implications. This wasn't just about freeing his son anymore. It was about reuniting Elliot with a daughter he didn't know existed. About acknowledging a grandchild who carried both Riley and Navajo blood. "Dawn," he repeated the name, testing it on his tongue. "My granddaughter." Juanita watched him closely, her dark eyes missing nothing of the emotions playing across his weathered face. "This is why you must reach Fort Benson in time," she said, "not only to save your son's life, but to give Dawn her father." Mason nodded, a new determination flowing through him. "I have to get there. Somehow I have to make it." "Your horse is healing," Juanita said. "But he cannot carry you tomorrow or the next day. Perhaps on the third day he might be strong enough for a short journey." "Too late," Mason said, the familiar desperation returning. "Even if I left him here and went on foot, I'd never make it in time. Not at my age, not in this heat." Juanita was silent for a long moment, her gaze turned inward as if weighing some private decision. Finally, she looked at Mason with renewed intensity. "There is a way," she said, "but it will require a promise from you. A sacred vow that must not be broken." "What promise?" Mason asked, willing to grasp at any hope, however slim. "If I help you reach Fort Benson in time to save your son." Juanita said, her voice taking on a formal quality. "You must vow that after he is free, you will bring him to meet his daughter. You will acknowledge her as blood of your blood, despite her mixed heritage. You will ensure that Elliot knows of her and is given the choice to be her father in truth, not just in blood." The request struck at the heart of Mason's deepest prejudices, the unexamined assumptions he had carried throughout his long life. Could he truly accept a half-Navajo grandchild? Could he introduce her to his friends, his few remaining relatives, as a Riley? Could he overcome the ingrained beliefs of a lifetime? He thought of Elliot, waiting in a cell for a death he didn't deserve. He thought of the unnamed girl Dawn growing up without knowing her father. He thought of Anna, whose only crime had been loving across a boundary that neither white nor native society was prepared to accept. And he realized that the question wasn't whether he could accept Dawn, but whether he deserved the privilege of knowing her at all. "I swear it," he said, his voice steady and clear in the gathering dusk. "On my wife's grave, on everything I hold sacred. If Elliot is freed, I will bring him to his daughter. I will acknowledge her as my grandild before all the world, whatever the cost." Juanita held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any hesitation or duplicity. Finding none, she nodded once satisfied. "Then we will begin at dawn," she said. "Rest now. Tomorrow brings a hard journey." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, Mason settled himself beside Copper, one hand resting on the horse's warm neck. Despite the tumult of revelations, despite the uncertainty of the path ahead, he felt a strange peace stealing over him. Whatever happened in the days to come, he was no longer alone in his desperate race against time. And somewhere beyond the mountains, a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's smile waited unknowing for a future that now seemed possible again. Mason closed his eyes, and for the first time in many nights, his dreams were not of failure and loss, but of a dawn breaking over new possibilities. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert in a blaze of amber, and rose painting the sand and stone in colors so vivid they seemed almost liquid. Mason woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and his mouth felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The events of the previous day came rushing back. Copper's injury, Juanita's appearance, the staggering revelations about Elliot and Anna, and the existence of a granddaughter he had never known. He turned to check on Copper. The horse was awake, his eyes clearer than they had been since the injury. More remarkably, the gelding was attempting to rise, his good legs braced as he struggled to find his balance. "Easy, boy," Mason murmured, scrambling to his feet. "Don't rush it." He placed a steadying hand on Copper's neck, guiding the horse as he finally managed to stand. Copper's injured leg barely touched the ground, but he remained upright, swaying slightly as he adjusted to his new position. It was a vast improvement from yesterday's collapse, yet still far from the strong, sure-footed mount Mason needed for the journey to Fort Benson. "You're tougher than old leather," Mason told the horse, his voice rough with affection. but you're still in no shape to travel." "He heals well?" came Juanita's voice from behind him. Mason turned to find the Navajo shaman watching them from the edge of their small camp. She looked as if she had been awake for hours, her silver hair freshly braided, her weathered face composed. In her arms, she carried a bundle wrapped in deerskin. "The medicine is working," she continued, approaching Copper to examine his injured leg. "But as I said, he cannot carry you today or tomorrow, perhaps the day after for a short distance only." Mason nodded, resignation settling heavily on his shoulders. "Which means I won't reach Fort Benson in time." "Not on horseback," Juanita agreed. "But there are other ways to travel." As she unwrapped the deerskin bundle, revealing several items, a small clay pot sealed with beeswax, a leather water skin that looked newly filled, a pouch of what appeared to be dried meat, and a pair of moccasins, unlike any Mason had seen before. They were intricately worked with beads and porcupine quills, forming patterns of lightning and eagle feathers across the tops. "These belonged to my husband," Juanita said, setting the moccasins on the ground before him. "A walker between worlds. A man who could cover more ground in a day than most could in 3. Mason eyed the footwear skeptically. "No disrespect, but I don't see how a pair of moccasins is going to get me to Fort Benson in time. It's still at least 2 days' hard ride from here." "For an ordinary man, on an ordinary journey, yes," Juanita said. "But you have made a sacred vow, and the spirits of this land listen to such things." She picked up the clay pot and removed the beeswax seal. A pungent, earthy smell filled the air, sharp enough to make Mason's eyes water slightly. "This is made from sacred plants that grow only on the highest mesas," Juanita explained. "My people have used it for generations when a runner must carry news far and fast. It gives strength to the legs, clarity to the mind, and allows a person to go without rest for many hours." Mason frowned. "Some kind of stimulant, like coffee." Juanita smiled faintly at the comparison. "Much stronger. And unlike your coffee, it does not leave you weaker afterward. But it is only part of what you will need." She gestured to the moccasins. "These were made with prayers woven into each stitch. They will protect your feet from stone and thorn, and they will remember the paths my husband once walked." Mason's skepticism must have shown on his face, for Juanita's expression grew more serious. "You are a man who believes in what he can touch and see," she observed. "This is not wrong, but there are forces in this world beyond what your eyes tell you. You have felt them already, in the bond with your horse, in the love for your son. The line between what you call real and what you call spirit is thinner than you know." She held out the moccasins. "You made a vow to acknowledge your granddaughter, to bring her father to her. That vow has power. These will help you fulfill it." Mason hesitated. He was not a superstitious man. His faith, such as it was, had been shaped by hard experiences and practical necessities, not mystical beliefs. Yet Juanita had already proven her knowledge of healing plants was real enough. Copper's improved condition was evidence of that. And what choice did he have? Elliot's execution was now just 4 days away. Without some extraordinary measure, Mason would never reach Fort Benson in time. He took the moccasins, surprised by their lightness. "If there's even a chance this might work, I have to try," he conceded. "For Elliot, and for Dawn." Juanita nodded, satisfied. "You will need to leave your boots behind, and most of what you carry. Take only the pardon water and a little food. Anything more will slow you." "What about Copper?" Mason asked, glancing at his horse. "I can't just abandon him." "I will stay with him," Juanita said simply. "I will continue to treat his wound. When he is strong enough, I will guide him to a place where he can find shade and water until you return." Mason felt a surge of gratitude quickly followed by suspicion. "Why would you do this for me? For us? After what happened to your granddaughter?" "I do not do it for you alone," Juanita replied. "I do it for Anna, whose spirit cannot rest while injustice remains. I do it for Dawn, who deserves to know her father. And I do it for the truth, which has been buried too long." She knelt and began to prepare a small fire. "Now, eat something. Drink water. Then you must put on the moccasins and take the medicine. The journey ahead will test even a strong man like yourself." Mason did as she instructed, chewing the jerky without really tasting it, his mind racing with doubts and possibilities. He checked on Copper one more time, relieved to see the horse still standing, then reluctantly removed his worn cavalry boots. The moccasins fit surprisingly well, molding to his feet, as if they had been made for him. The leather was soft, yet sturdy, and the beadwork more intricate than he had first realized, catching the early morning light in flashes of blue and red. Juanita handed him the clay pot. "Drink half now," she instructed. "Save the rest for tomorrow, when your strength begins to fail. And remember, once you begin, you must not stop until nightfall. The medicine will keep you moving, but if you rest, your body will stiffen, and you will not be able to continue." Mason nodded, steeling himself, as he raised the pot to his lips. The liquid inside was bitter with an underlying sweetness that lingered on the tongue. He forced himself to swallow half as instructed, fighting the urge to gag at the unfamiliar taste. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a warmth began to spread through his limbs, starting in his stomach and radiating outward. It wasn't unpleasant, rather like the feeling after a small sip of good whiskey, but magnified and focused. His fatigue seemed to evaporate, replaced by a humming energy that made him want to move. "You feel it now," Juanita said, not a question but an observation. "Good. It is time to begin." She gestured toward the east, where the sun was now fully above the horizon. "Fort Benson lies that way beyond the flatlands and the river. Follow the sun until midday, then look for the tall rocks that stand like men. Pass between them and continue toward the mountains." Mason committed the directions to memory, surprised at how clear and sharp his mind felt. The landmarks Juanita described matched his own knowledge of the territory, but she spoke of them with the intimate familiarity of one who had traveled these lands for decades. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what she was doing. "For everything." Juanita acknowledged his gratitude with a slight nod. "Go now. Dawn is waiting, though she does not know it. Elliot is waiting, though he has lost hope. Time passes differently for those who suffer." Mason secured the pardon in his shirt close to his heart. He tucked the water skin and remaining medicine into a small pouch at his waist, leaving behind his heavier gear. With a final glance at Copper, who watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the necessity of their separation, he turned east. The first steps felt strange in the unfamiliar footwear, but within minutes, Mason found himself moving with surprising ease. The moccasins seemed to find secure purchase on even the loosest sand, guiding his feet around sharp stones without conscious effort on his part. More remarkable was the energy flowing through his body. At 63, Mason had grown accustomed to the various aches and stiffnesses that accompanied age. His knees usually protested the first hour of riding each day. His lower back often twinged when he dismounted after a long stretch in the saddle. Now these familiar discomforts were absent, replaced by a vigor he hadn't felt in 20 years. He lengthened his stride, testing this newfound strength. To his astonishment, he found he could maintain a pace halfway between a walk and a jog without any strain. The landscape began to flow past him more quickly than he would have believed possible on foot. As the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in the cloudless blue sky, Mason fell into a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of his heart. Left foot, right foot, breath in, breath out. The moccasins whispered against the desert floor, making barely any sound compared to the heavy tread of his usual boots. His mind, too, had taken on a peculiar clarity. Thoughts came and went like clouds across the sky, distinct yet flowing. He found himself remembering moments from his life with unusual vividness, riding with Elliot. When the boy was just 5 years old, Ellen laughing as she hung laundry in the yard of their ranch, the weight of his cavalry saber in his hand during his final charge at Glorietta Pass. And mingled with these memories were new thoughts, new possibilities. What would Dawn look like? Would she have Elliot's sandy hair or Anna's dark eyes? Would she be shy with these strange white men suddenly claiming to be her family, or would she accept them with a child's easy adaptability? What would life be like with a half-Navajo granddaughter in a territory where such mixing of blood was viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst? The questions had no immediate answers, but Mason found that they didn't trouble him as they might have before. Instead, they felt like tributaries joining the river of his purpose, strengthening rather than diverting it. By midday, Mason had covered ground that would have taken hours on horseback. The flat plains Juanita had mentioned stretched before him, shimmering with heat. In the distance, he could make out the landmarks she had described, 2 tall rock formations jutting from the earth like sentinels. He paused only long enough to take a small sip of water, mindful of Juanita's warning not to rest. The medicine's effects showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, he felt stronger as the day progressed, as if his body were remembering capabilities long forgotten. The sun beat down mercilessly, but even this seemed less punishing than usual. Sweat evaporated almost as soon as it formed on his skin, leaving a faint crust of salt, but no persistent discomfort. The moccasins protected his feet perfectly. Not a single blister or hot spot formed despite the unaccustomed exertion. As he approached the twin rock formations, Mason was struck by how accurately they resembled standing men. One was taller, with a jutting formation near the top that suggested a proud profile. The other was broader, with a slumped appearance that reminded him of a weary soldier at the end of a long march. Together, they created a natural gateway into the next stretch of his journey. Mason passed between them, feeling a strange sensation as he did so, like walking through a curtain of cool air, though the temperature hadn't changed. For just a moment, he thought he heard voices on the wind, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but somehow recognized. Then the sensation passed, and he was through, facing the distant mountains that marked the approach to Fort Benson. The afternoon stretched before him long and demanding. The terrain became more challenging, less sand, more rock, with occasional arroyos cutting across his path. Yet the moccasins continued to guide his feet, unerringly, finding safe passages where they existed, creating them where they did not. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Mason's thoughts turned again to Elliot. His son had been in prison for 2 years now, maintaining his innocence, even as evidence mounted against him. What had sustained him through those long months of confinement? Had he held on to the memory of Anna, of their secret love? Had he grieved for her alone in his cell, unable to properly mourn the woman he had planned to marry? And what would Elliot think when he learned about Dawn? Would he embrace fatherhood despite the circumstances? Would he be willing to acknowledge a half-Navajo child in a society that looked askance at such unions? Mason realized with a pang that he didn't know the answers to these questions. In truth, he didn't know his adult son as well as he should. After Ellen's death, they had worked side by side on the ranch, but their conversations had rarely ventured beyond practical matters. Mason had assumed Elliot's silence meant he was like his father, private, self-contained. Now he wondered if it had instead been a wall between them built of things unsaid and feelings unexpressed. "I'll do better," Mason promised aloud, his voice startling in the empty landscape. "If I get him out of this, I'll do better." The words seemed to give him renewed energy. He quickened his pace, eating up the miles with long, steady strides. The mountains grew larger, more defined, their rugged profiles etched against the deepening blue of the late afternoon sky. As twilight approached, Mason began to look for a place to make camp for the night. Juanita had warned him not to stop until darkness fell, and now he understood why. The extraordinary energy that had propelled him throughout the day was beginning to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue unlike anything he had experienced before. It wasn't gradual. It descended on him all at once, as if a switch had been flipped within his body. He barely made it to a small outcropping of rock before his legs gave out. He sank to the ground, gasping, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The transition from superhuman endurance to utter depletion was so abrupt it was almost frightening. Mason managed to unstopper his water skin with shaking hands, taking small, measured sips. The water helped, but only marginally. His body demanded rest insistently and immediately. He had just enough presence of mind to check that the pardon was still secure against his chest before he surrendered to unconsciousness. His sleep was deep and dreamless, a black void without memory or sensation. When he woke, the desert was bathed in pre-dawn light, a soft, grayish blue that made the landscape seem almost gentle. Mason sat up, expecting pain, stiffness, the rebellion of a body pushed far beyond its normal limits. To his astonishment, he felt rested. Sore, yes, but not debilitated. Hungry, but not weak. He flexed his feet in the moccasins, finding no blisters, no hot spots, only a pleasant warmth where he would have expected agony. "Impossible," he murmured, but the evidence of his own body couldn't be denied. Mason ate a small portion of the dried meat Juanita had provided, washing it down with carefully measured swallows of water. As the sun's first rays touched the eastern horizon, he uncorked the clay pot containing the remaining medicine. The liquid seemed to have thickened overnight, its smell even more pungent in the cool morning air. He hesitated before drinking. Yesterday's journey had been extraordinary, covering ground that should have taken twice as long. But it had also been deeply strange, challenging his understanding of what was possible. Part of him, the practical, skeptical part that had served him well for 63 years, wanted to dismiss it all as some fever dream brought on by heat and desperation. Yet here he was, a day's journey closer to Fort Benson than he had any right to be, his body recovered from exertions that should have left him crippled. And waiting at the end of his journey was not just his son's freedom, but the discovery of a granddaughter he had never known existed. Mason raised the pot to his lips and drank the remaining medicine in one long swallow. As before, the effect began in his core and radiated outward, a spreading warmth, a humming energy, a clarity of thought that swept away fatigue and doubt. He rose to his feet, feeling once again the strange lightness in his limbs, the readiness to move. The sun was clearing the horizon now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Mason oriented himself toward Fort Benson and began to run. Not the labored jog of an aging man, but the ground-eating lope of a seasoned messenger. The moccasins seemed to propel him forward with each step, as if they remembered journeys taken long ago and were eager to repeat them. The landscape flowed past him, sand and stone and scattered vegetation merging into a continuous stream of impressions rather than distinct features. Time itself seemed to alter, stretching and compressing in ways Mason couldn't quite grasp. Sometimes he felt as if he had been running for hours, only to notice that the sun had barely moved in the sky. Other times he would blink and find the light had shifted dramatically, suggesting the passage of significant time that he hadn't consciously registered. By mid-morning, he reached the river that marked the halfway point to Fort Benson. In the dry season, it was little more than a wide, shallow stream easily fordable. Mason waded across the cool water, a momentary relief against his skin. On the far bank, he paused only long enough to refill his water skin before continuing eastward. The terrain changed as he progressed, less open desert, more rolling hills covered in scrubby juniper and pinon pine. The air carried the scent of resin and dry grass, occasionally sweetened by the fragrance of wildflowers that had managed to bloom despite the harsh conditions. As Mason ran, his thoughts turned again to the revelations Juanita had shared. Anna and Elliot in love, planning a future together despite the social barriers. Anna carrying their child when she was killed. Dawn born through a desperate measure after her mother's death. Each piece of information was a stone in a mosaic that formed a picture of his son's life. A picture Mason had never seen before. He had always believed he knew Elliot understood him in the way fathers understand their sons. Now he realized how much had been hidden from him, how many aspects of Elliot's heart and mind had remained unexplored. It wasn't just the relationship with Anna. It was the courage it must have taken to pursue that relationship in a society that condemned such unions. The depth of feeling that would make a man willing to defy convention, family expectations, even the law, for the woman he loved. Had Mason ever loved that deeply? He had cared for Ellen, had grieved when she died, had remained faithful to her memory in the years since. But had he ever felt the kind of passion that would make him risk everything? He wasn't sure, and the uncertainty troubled him. Perhaps that was why Elliot had kept his relationship with Anna secret, because he sensed his father wouldn't understand, wouldn't approve, wouldn't support him in his choice. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered, as he ran the words carried away by the wind of his passage. "I should have been someone you could trust with your heart." The sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Mason's pace never faltered. His breathing remained steady. His legs continued their tireless rhythm across the changing landscape. The medicine's effect seemed even stronger than the previous day, propelling him forward with a force that felt almost separate from his own will. In the late afternoon, he crested a rise and saw in the distance the distinctive outline of Fort Benson. The American flag flew above its wooden walls, a splash of color against the muted tones of the desert. Smoke rose from cook fires within, and the small settlement that had grown up around the fort showed signs of activity. Tiny figures moving between buildings, horses in corrals, laundry hanging on lines. So close. After 2 years of legal battles, after selling everything he owned to pay for lawyers and witnesses, after this extraordinary journey across the desert, Mason was finally within sight of his goal, within sight of Elliot's salvation. But the fort was still several hours away at his current pace, and the sun was already beginning its descent. By the time he reached the gates, it would be well into evening. Would the commander receive him? Would he honor the pardon at such a late hour? Or would he insist on waiting until morning, perhaps finding some new delay, some new obstacle to place between Elliot and freedom? Mason pushed these worries aside, focusing only on maintaining his pace, on covering the remaining distance before his strength gave out. One foot in front of the other. Breath in, breath out. The rhythm that had carried him this far would carry him to the end. As the sun touched the western mountains, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Mason approached the fort's main gate. His extraordinary pace had slowed somewhat, in the final miles the medicine's effect beginning to wane as daylight faded. Still, he had covered a distance in 2 days that should have taken twice that time on horseback. The two soldiers on guard duty straightened as he approached, hands moving to their rifles more from habit than any perception of threat from this lone, unarmed man. "Halt!" one called as Mason came within hailing distance. "State your business." Mason slowed to a walk, fighting the urge to collapse now that his destination was reached. The medicine was fading rapidly, and with it, the superhuman endurance that had sustained him. Every step now required conscious effort. Every breath was a struggle against the fatigue waiting to claim him. "My name is Mason Riley," he called back, his voice raspy from thirst and exertion. "I'm here to see Commander Wallace. I have a pardon for my son, Elliot Riley." The guards exchanged glances. "You're on foot," one observed, suspicion evident in his tone. "Where's your horse?" "Injured," Mason replied, too exhausted for lengthy explanations. "Please, I need to see the commander immediately. It's urgent." The older of the two guards, a sergeant by his stripes, studied Mason with narrowed eyes. "Riley? Wait! You're the father of that prisoner scheduled for hanging, the one who killed the Indian girl." Mason bit back a sharp retort about his son's innocence. This was not the time for arguments. "Yes, that's my son, and I have his pardon from the territorial governor. He's to be released immediately." The sergeant frowned. "First I've heard of any pardon. Commander Wallace didn't mention it at muster this morning." "Because he doesn't know yet," Mason said, impatience edging into his voice. "I'm bringing it now. Please, I've traveled for days to get here in time." The younger guard leaned toward his companion. "Sarge, maybe we should let him in. If he really has a pardon." The sergeant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but I'll have to escort you to headquarters myself, and I'll need to see this pardon before we go any further." Mason reached into his shirt and withdrew the document, now creased and sweat-stained, but with the governor's seal still clearly visible. The sergeant took it, unfolded it carefully, and scanned the formal language within. His eyebrows rose as he read. "This appears genuine," he admitted, refolding the pardon and returning it to Mason. "Follow me." The gates swung open, and Mason entered Fort Benson for the first time in over 2 years. The last time he had been here, it was to visit Elliot shortly after his arrest. The memory of that day, his son in chains insisting on his innocence, while Mason struggled to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong, rushed back with painful clarity. The fort hadn't changed much. The same dusty parade ground, the same orderly rows of barracks and officers' quarters, the same blockhouse looming at the center of the compound. As they crossed toward headquarters, Mason was acutely aware of the curious glances from soldiers and civilians alike. News traveled fast in isolated outposts like this. Everyone would know who he was, why he had come. Commander Wallace's office was in the blockhouse, a Spartan room dominated by a large desk covered in maps and papers. The man himself was tall and lean, with a meticulously trimmed mustache and the rigid posture of a career military man. He looked up with a frown as the sergeant ushered Mason in. "Sir," the sergeant began, "this is Mason Riley. He claims to have a pardon for his son from the governor." Wallace's frown deepened. "Does he indeed? Let me see it." Mason produced the pardon again, fighting to keep his hand steady as fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. Wallace took the document and studied it with far more attention than the sergeant had, his expression growing increasingly sour as he read. "This appears to be in order," he said, finally looking up at Mason with undisguised displeasure. "Though I must say, I find the timing extremely convenient. The execution is scheduled for the day after tomorrow." "There's nothing convenient about it," Mason replied, struggling to maintain his composure. I've been fighting for this pardon for months. The governor only signed it last week after reviewing new evidence that proves my son's innocence. Evidence that conveniently implicates Captain Harrington, Wallace observed dryly. A decorated officer with an exemplary record. An officer who has since been arrested for theft of army supplies and taking bribes, Mason countered. As I'm sure you're aware. A muscle twitched in Wallace's jaw. Those charges are still pending, and they have no bearing on the matter of your son's conviction for the murder of a Navajo woman. The pardon says otherwise, Mason said, gesturing to the document still in Wallace's hands. By order of the governor, my son is to be released immediately. Not the day after tomorrow. Not tomorrow. Now. Wallace's eyes narrowed dangerously. You would do well to remember who you're addressing, Mr. Riley. I am still the commanding officer of this fort, and I will not be dictated to by civilians. Mason felt a surge of anger, hot and clarifying despite his exhaustion. And you would do well to remember that ignoring a governor's pardon is a serious offense, Commander, one that could end your career as surely as Captain Harrington's crimes ended his. The two men stared at each other across the desk, the tension between them almost palpable. Finally, Wallace looked down at the pardon again, his expression unreadable. Very well, he said after a long moment. I will honor the governor's order. But I want it noted that I do so under protest. I remain convinced of your son's guilt. Note whatever you like, Mason said wearily. Just release my son. Wallace nodded to the sergeant. Take Mr. Riley to the cells. Have Corporal Jennings process the release paperwork. The prisoner's personal effects should be returned to him. The sergeant saluted and gestured for Mason to follow. As they left the office, Mason heard Wallace mutter something under his breath, not quite audible, but the tone was unmistakably bitter. The fort's prison was a separate building behind the blockhouse, a low stone structure with small barred windows set high in the walls. The smell hit Mason as soon as they entered unwashed bodies, stale food, the sharp tang of the bucket used as a latrine. It brought back memories of his own brief imprisonment during the war, and he felt a fresh wave of guilt that Elliot had endured these conditions for 2 long years. The sergeant led him down a narrow corridor lined with cells. Most were empty. Fort Benson wasn't large enough to house many prisoners, but from the last cell on the left came the sound of movement as their footsteps approached. Riley, the sergeant called. You've got a visitor. And news. Mason stepped forward, his heart pounding as he caught his first glimpse of his son in months. Elliot stood gripping the bars of his cell, his face a study in disbelief as he recognized his visitor. Pa, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Is that really you? Mason moved closer, reaching through the bars to clasp his son's hand. It's me, Elliot. I've brought the pardon. You're being released. Elliot's face transformed, hope and confusion warring in his expression. Released? You mean it's over? I'm free. You're free, Mason confirmed, his voice breaking on the words. The governor signed your pardon last week. All charges dropped. Elliot's legs seemed to give out. He sank to his knees, still clutching his father's hand, through the bars, tears streaming down his face. Thank God, he whispered. Thank God. The sergeant cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll get Corporal Jennings with the keys and paperwork. Give you 2 a moment. As the sergeant's footsteps receded, Mason knelt to be level with his son. Elliot had changed in the months since his last visit. He was thinner, his face more gaunt, his eyes shadowed by dark circles. His sandy hair, once kept short and neat, now hung long and unkempt around his face. But it was the new lines around his mouth, the wariness in his gaze, that hurt Mason the most visible evidence of the toll his imprisonment had taken. "I never gave up," Mason said, gripping Elliot's hand tightly. "I want you to know that. Even when it seemed hopeless, I never stopped fighting for you." Elliot nodded, struggling to master his emotions. "I know, Pa. I never doubted you. It's just, I was starting to think it wouldn't be enough, that I was going to die for something I didn't do." "That's not going to happen now," Mason assured him. "The witness came forward just like we hoped, testified that he saw Harrington leaving the scene right after Anna was killed." At the mention of Anna's name, Elliot's expression crumpled again. "Anna," he repeated softly. "I still can't believe she's gone. That I never got to say goodbye." Mason hesitated, weighing the revelation he carried against the shock Elliot had already experienced today. Was this the right moment to tell him about Dawn? Or should he wait until they were away from the fort, until Elliot had had time to adjust to his freedom? Before he could decide, footsteps announced the return of the sergeant, accompanied by a young corporal carrying a ring of keys and a clipboard of papers. "Stand back from the door, prisoner," the corporal instructed, selecting a key from the ring. Elliot released his father's hand and moved back, watching with barely contained emotion as the cell door swung open for the first time in 2 years, not for exercise or meals under guard, but for freedom. "Sign here," the corporal said, holding out the clipboard and a pencil, "acknowledging receipt of your personal effects and the conditions of your release." Elliot's hand trembled slightly as he signed. The corporal handed him a small canvas bag containing whatever possessions he had had with him when arrested. From the lightness of the bag, it couldn't be much. "Your horse was sold to cover prison costs," the sergeant informed them. "Standard procedure for long-term prisoners. You'll have to make your own arrangements for transportation." Mason nodded, too focused on the reality of Elliot's freedom to be concerned about such details. "We'll manage. Is there anything else, or are we free to go?" The sergeant looked uncomfortable. "Commander Wallace suggested you might want to leave before morning muster. There are some in the fort who still believe your son is guilty. Might be safer to be gone before they all hear about the pardon." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Mason felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it. Elliot, exonerated, but still treated as guilty, still in danger from those who had been complicit in his wrongful imprisonment. "We understand," Elliot said before Mason could respond, his voice steady despite the strain evident in his face. "We'll be gone by dawn." The sergeant nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. You can collect the rest of your belongings from the quartermaster. Not much, just some clothes and books, I think." With that, he and the corporal left them alone in the corridor, the echo of their boots fading as they returned to their duties. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other, the reality of their reunion too overwhelming for words. Then Elliot stepped forward out of the cell and embraced his father. Mason held him tightly, feeling the bones too prominent beneath his son's prison shirt, smelling the institutional staleness that clung to his hair and skin. "Let's get out of here," Mason said when they finally separated. "Get your things. We've got a lot to talk about, and I don't want to do it within these walls." Elliot nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Where will we go? The ranch is gone, isn't it? You sold it to pay for the lawyers." "Yes," Mason admitted, "but that doesn't matter now. We'll figure something out. First, let's just get away from this place." They collected Elliot's few remaining possessions from the quartermaster, a spare set of clothes now too large for his diminished frame, 2 dog-eared books, a small wooden carving of a horse that Mason recognized as one Elliot had made as a boy. Everything else from his former life was gone, sold, or lost in the 2 years of his imprisonment. As they walked toward the fort's gate, Mason was acutely aware of the eyes following them, some curious, some hostile, none friendly. The news of Elliot's pardon was already spreading, and not everyone was pleased by it. Mason kept a protective hand on his son's shoulder, his body tensed for any sign of trouble. But they reached the gate without incident. The same guards who had admitted Mason earlier opened it for them, now their expressions carefully neutral. As the heavy wooden doors swung closed behind them, Elliot took a deep breath of the evening air, his first as a free man in 2 years. "I almost can't believe it," he said softly. "I was sure I'd never leave that place alive." Mason squeezed his shoulder. "You're free now, and I promise you no one will ever take that freedom from you again." They walked in silence for a time, putting distance between themselves and the fort. The sun had set, but a full moon was rising, bathing the desert in silver light that made navigation easy enough. Mason led them toward a small stand of cottonwoods he had noticed on his approach, a likely sign of water and a good place to rest for what remained of the night. As they walked, Mason was acutely aware of the fading of the medicine's effects. His legs felt leaden now, his earlier superhuman endurance replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made each step an effort. The moccasins, which had seemed to propel him forward throughout his journey, now felt like any other footwear, though still surprisingly comfortable given the distance he had covered. Elliot noticed his father's increasingly labored gait. "Pa, are you all right? You look exhausted. How did you get here anyway? Where's Copper?" "It's a long story," Mason replied, grateful to see the cottonwoods growing closer. "One that's going to sound pretty unbelievable, to be honest. But we should rest first. I'm about at the end of my strength." The cottonwoods did indeed mark the location of a small spring, little more than a seep, really, but enough to refill their water skins and provide the promise of a more comfortable night than the open desert would allow. Mason sank down with his back against one of the trees, his legs finally giving out, now that their journey was complete. Elliot settled beside him, his movements carrying the caution of a man unaccustomed to freedom. "You look like you've been through hell, Pa. What happened? Last I heard you were still in Tucson, waiting for the governor's decision." Mason took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. How much should he tell Elliot tonight? The young man had already experienced the emotional shock of unexpected freedom. Was he ready for the even greater revelation of Dawn's existence? But looking at his son's face in the moonlight, the new lines of suffering, the hard-won wisdom in his eyes, Mason realized that Elliot was no longer the boy he had tried to protect. He was a man who had faced death and survived, who deserved the complete truth, however difficult it might be to hear. "Elliot," he began carefully, "before I tell you how I got here, there's something more important you need to know. Something about Anna." At the mention of her name, Elliot's expression tightened with pain. "What about her?" he asked, his voice low and carefully controlled. Mason reached out, placing a hand on his son's arm. "She was carrying your child when she died." Elliot stared at him, uncomprehending at first, then with dawning shock. "What? How could you possibly know that Anna and we never told anyone about us?" "I know that now," Mason said gently, "but I learned it from someone who did know. Someone who was close to Anna. Her grandmother, a Navajo woman named Juanita." Elliot's face had gone pale in the moonlight. "Anna's grandmother, you met her. When how?" "That's part of the long story," Mason said. "But yes, I met her. She found me in the desert after Copper was injured. She helped me, and she told me about you and Anna, about your plans to marry, despite what everyone would say." Elliot looked away, emotions warring on his face. "We were going to leave," he said after a moment, his voice barely audible. Go east, where no one knew us. Start fresh somewhere people might accept us, or at least leave us alone. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with all the dreams that had died with Anna. Mason felt a fresh surge of guilt that his son had felt unable to share these plans with him, had assumed probably correctly that his father wouldn't approve. I'm sorry, Mason said the words, inadequate but necessary. Sorry that you didn't feel you could tell me. Sorry that I would have been less than supportive. Elliot looked at him in surprise. It was perhaps the first apology of this kind Mason had ever offered his son. You'd have come around, Elliot said after a moment, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced of this. Eventually, once you got to know her. I hope I would have, Mason agreed, knowing his past self well enough to doubt it. But that's not the most important part of what I need to tell you, son. Elliot tensed again, bracing himself. You said Anna was pregnant. He said the words clearly difficult for him to speak. But she died. The baby died with her. Mason shook his head slowly. No, Elliot. The baby lived. For a moment, Elliot seemed unable to process the words. He stared at his father, his expression blank with incomprehension. That's impossible, he said finally. Anna was... They said she was strangled. The baby couldn't have... Anna didn't die immediately, Mason explained. She was found by children from her tribe still alive but badly injured. They brought her to Juanita, who tried to save her with traditional medicines. Anna lived for 3 days, but her injuries were too severe. Elliot's breathing had quickened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And the baby? He asked, his voice cracking. What happened to the baby? Anna's body was preparing to miscarry, Mason continued gently. Too early for the child to survive normally, but the tribe's midwife performed what Juanita called a cutting, taking the baby from Anna's body after she had passed. Against all odds, the child survived. Elliot stared at him, tears welling in his eyes. My child is alive, he whispered. I have a son or daughter, a daughter. Mason told him, his own voice thick with emotion. Her name is Dawn. She's 2 years old now, being raised by Juanita's sister's family. She has her mother's eyes and your smile, according to Juanita. Elliot covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mason sat quietly, giving his son the space to absorb this world-altering news. After several minutes, Elliot looked up, his cheeks wet with tears, but his expression transformed, grief still present, but now mingled with wonder, with a desperate, fragile hope. Where is she? He asked. Can I see her? Does she know about me? She's with Juanita's people, Mason answered, and yes, you can see her. In fact, I promised Juanita that I would bring you to meet your daughter as soon as you were free. It was part of the bargain she made to help me reach the fort in time. Bargain? Elliot repeated, confusion momentarily overriding his emotional turmoil. Pa, what exactly happened after you got the pardon? How did you meet Juanita? And where is Copper? Mason smiled tiredly. That's the part of the story you're going to find hard to believe. But I guess we've got the rest of the night, and it's a tale worth telling. As the moon climbed higher in the desert sky, casting the landscape in its silvery light, Mason recounted his extraordinary journey. The ambush, Copper's injury, Juanita's appearance, and her revelations, the magical moccasins and medicine that had allowed him to cover 2 days' ride on foot in the same amount of time. Elliot listened in silence, his expression shifting between disbelief, wonder, and a growing understanding of just how far his father had gone to save him, not just in distance traveled, but in beliefs challenged. and prejudices overcome. When Mason finished his tale, Elliot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You made a promise to acknowledge Dawn, to accept her as your granddaughter regardless of her mixed blood." Mason nodded. "I did, and I meant it, Elliot. I know I've been set in my ways. The war left marks on me that went deeper than this scar on my arm, made me see things in black and white, when the world is full of shades between." He looked at his son, directly holding his gaze. "But I want you to know that I'm ready to see Dawn as family, as a Riley. Whatever that means for our future, whatever challenges it brings, I'll face them alongside you, if you'll let me." Elliot studied his father's face as if searching for any hint of reservation or insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I think Anna would have too." They sat in companionable silence for a time, each lost in his own thoughts. The revelation of Dawn's existence had changed everything for both of them, giving Elliot a reason beyond mere survival to embrace his freedom, giving Mason a chance to be the father and grandfather he should have been all along. "When can we go to her?" Elliot asked finally, the eagerness in his voice unmistakable despite his exhaustion. "To Dawn, I mean, and to thank Juanita for everything she's done." "First light," Mason promised. "I left Copper in Juanita's care. She was going to take him to a place with shade and water until I returned. I'm guessing that's near where her people are camped, and where Dawn is." Elliot nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "First light," he repeated. "I've waited 2 years for freedom. I can wait a few more hours to meet my daughter." As they settled down to rest beneath the cottonwoods, Mason found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A journey that had begun in desperation was ending in hope. A family fractured by prejudice and tragedy was being given a second chance. And somewhere in the desert, a little girl was sleeping, unaware that her father and grandfather were coming to find her, to embrace her, to welcome her into a future none of them could have imagined just days before. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient witnesses to countless human dramas played out beneath their distant light. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion and emotion pulling him toward sleep. But before consciousness faded, he whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to God, to the spirits Juanita had invoked, to whatever forces had guided his steps across the desert and brought him against all odds to this moment of reconciliation and renewal. Dawn broke over the desert in a blaze of gold, washing away the silver moonlight with warmer hues. Mason woke first, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, but his mind clear, free from the strange half-dreams that had haunted his rest. He watched the light change across the landscape, thinking of the journey ahead and all that it meant. Beside him, Elliot still slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who had carried tension in every muscle for 2 long years and could finally release it. In repose, with the hard lines of watchfulness erased from his face, he looked younger, more like the son Mason remembered from before the arrest. But even in sleep, new lines of experience marked his features, testament to all he had endured. Mason let him rest as long as possible, knowing the day ahead would bring its own emotional demands. He busied himself checking their meager supplies, refilling the water skins from the small spring, and examining the moccasins that had carried him so impossibly far. In the clear light of morning, they looked like ordinary footwear, though the beadwork was certainly beautiful. Nothing about them suggested magical properties, yet Mason knew what he had experienced was real. As the sun cleared the horizon, Elliot stirred, then sat up abruptly, momentary panic flashing across his face as he found himself outdoors unconfined. Then recognition dawned, followed by a smile of such profound relief that Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It wasn't a dream," Elliot said softly. "I'm really free." Mason nodded. "You're free, and we have somewhere important to be." Elliot's expression shifted as the events of the previous evening came back to him, the revelation of Dawn's existence, the promise of meeting her today. "Dawn," he said, the name unfamiliar yet precious on his lips. "My daughter." "Your daughter," Mason confirmed. "If you're ready, we should start walking. I'm not sure exactly how far it is to where Juanita and her people are camped, but I'm guessing at least half a day's journey." Elliot rose to his feet, brushing dust from his prison-issued clothes. "I'm ready," he said with quiet determination. "I've been waiting for this moment without even knowing it." They set off toward the west, retracing Mason's extraordinary journey of the previous 2 days. Without the medicine's effects, Mason found the going much harder, his 63-year-old body protesting each step with aches and twinges. But he pushed through the discomfort, drawing strength from Elliot's presence beside him and the knowledge of what awaited at journey's end. As they walked, Elliot asked questions about Dawn, hungry for any details Mason could provide. "What does she look like? Does she talk yet? Has Juanita told her anything about me?" Mason shared what little he knew, wishing he had more concrete information to offer. "Juanita said she has Anna's eyes and your smile. She's 2 years old now, so I imagine she's talking some. As for whether she knows about you," he shook his head. "Juanita didn't say. I got the impression that they've kept her heritage quiet for her protection." Elliot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Because of Harrington," he said. "Even after he killed Anna and framed me, he might still have come after Dawn if he'd known she existed." "That's what Juanita suggested," Mason agreed. "Though with Harrington now arrested for his other crimes, that danger may be past." They walked in silence for a time, the sun climbing higher, bringing with it the familiar desert heat. Mason kept a careful eye on their water supply and on Elliot, concerned that his son's physical condition after 2 years of confinement might not be equal to the journey. But Elliot matched his pace without complaint, driven by a determination that seemed to override any physical weakness. Around midday, they paused in the shadow of the twin rock formations Mason had passed on his outbound journey. The men stood tall against the sky, their stone faces impassive, guarding the pathway between worlds. As they shared a small portion of their meager food supplies, Elliot studied the formations with interest. "They really do look like people," he observed. "Guardians of some kind." Mason nodded. "When I passed between them yesterday, it felt different, like crossing a boundary that wasn't just physical. Juanita's medicine was affecting my perceptions, I suppose. Or maybe there was something real to feel," Elliot suggested. "The Navajo believe certain places have special power, what they call chindi, I think. Anna told me once that her people can sense things in the landscape that white men have forgotten how to perceive." Mason glanced at his son, surprised by this knowledge. "You learned a lot from her." Elliot's expression softened with memory. "I did. She was remarkable, intelligent, curious about everything. She taught me to see the world differently." His voice caught slightly. "I wish you could have known her." "So do I," Mason said sincerely. "I judged before I understood. It's a failing I'm trying to correct." Elliot met his father's gaze, acknowledging the apology embedded in those words. "It's never too late to learn," he said. "Anna believed that. It's why she was studying to become a teacher. She thought education could bridge the gap between our peoples." The mention of Anna's aspirations reminded Mason of all that had been lost, not just a young woman's life, but the potential future she might have created. Yet from that tragedy had come dawn, a living bridge between two worlds, carrying forward Anna's hope in a way neither she nor Elliot could have foreseen. They resumed their journey, passing between the stone sentinels. Mason felt again that strange sensation, a whisper of coolness, a sense of crossing over, though less pronounced than during his medicine-enhanced journey. Elliot paused mid-stride, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something just beyond hearing. "You felt it too?" Mason asked. Elliot nodded slowly. "Like voices, or the memory of voices. Strange." They continued on the landscape, gradually changing from open desert to the more varied terrain Mason had traversed before reaching Fort Benson. The sun was well past its zenith when they spotted a thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the blue sky. "Could be a campfire," Mason suggested, pointing. "Maybe Juanita's people." Elliot quickened his pace, his fatigue seemingly forgotten in the prospect of reaching their destination. Mason followed his own tired legs, finding new energy in the promise of journey's end. As they drew closer, the source of the smoke became apparent, a small encampment nestled in a sheltered valley between rocky hills. From their vantage point on a ridge, they could see several hide-covered dwellings arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. A few horses grazed nearby, including a familiar chestnut gelding. "Copper!" Mason exclaimed, relief washing through him at the sight of his faithful horse, apparently recovered enough to stand and graze. Juanita kept her word. They descended toward the camp, moving carefully over the loose scree of the hillside. Before they reached level ground, a figure emerged from one of the dwellings, Juanita, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. She stood watching their approach, one hand shading her eyes, her posture straight and dignified despite her years. As they drew near, Mason saw recognition dawn in her expression. She raised a hand in greeting, then turned to call something toward the dwellings behind her. Two women emerged, one middle-aged, one younger, both with the same strong features and dark assessing eyes as Juanita. "Mason Riley," Juanita said as they reached the edge of the camp. "You have returned as the spirits said you would." "I have," Mason replied, "and I've brought my son as promised." Juanita's gaze shifted to Elliot, studying him with an intensity that seemed to look beyond surface appearances. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I see Anna in your eyes, though you did not know I would look for her there." Elliot stood very still under her scrutiny, his expression a complex mixture of grief, hope, and trepidation. "You knew her," he said softly. "You tried to save her." "I did," Juanita confirmed. "And in saving part of her, I saved part of you as well." She turned to the two women who had joined her. "This is my sister, Nima," she said, indicating the older woman, "and her daughter, Casa. They have cared for the child these 2 years." The women nodded in greeting, their expressions guarded but not hostile. Mason sensed they were reserving judgment, waiting to see what manner of men had come into their midst. "Where is she?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is Dawn?" Juanita exchanged glances with her sister, some silent communication passing between them. Then she gestured toward one of the smaller dwellings. "She is there with Casa's mother-in-law. The journey has been long and you are tired and dusty. Wash first at the spring, then you may meet her." Though clearly eager to see his daughter immediately, Elliot nodded, accepting the wisdom of Juanita's instruction. Mason felt a surge of pride in his son's restraint, his respect for the customs of these people who had protected and raised his child. Juanita led them to a small spring at the edge of the camp, where clear water bubbled up from between rocks before disappearing again into the sandy soil. As they washed away the dust of their journey, she spoke quietly. "The child knows nothing of you," she told Elliot. "She is too young to understand such things. We have called her Nitika, which means river of dreams in our language, though we also use the name Dawn as Anna wished. What have you told her about her mother? Elliot asked, running wet hands through his hair in an attempt to bring some order to its unkempt length. That she was brave and beautiful, and that she walks now among the ancestors, Juanita replied. When she is older, we will tell her more, but for now, she knows only that she is loved. And her appearance? Mason asked hesitantly. Does she look? She looks like both her parents, Juanita said, understanding the unspoken question. Her skin is lighter than ours, her hair has the color of dry grass in some lights. But her eyes are Anna's eyes, dark and seeing. She is a bridge between worlds, as such children always are. When they had made themselves as presentable as possible, given the circumstances, Juanita led them back toward the dwelling she had indicated earlier. The camp was quiet, though Mason noticed several pairs of eyes, watching them from doorways, and between structures, curious but cautious, assessing these strange white men who had come into their midst. At the entrance to the dwelling, Juanita paused. Wait here, she instructed, then ducked inside. Mason and Elliot stood side by side, tension radiating from both of them. Mason could hear his son's breathing, quick and shallow, with anticipation. He placed a hand on Elliot's shoulder, offering silent support. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, Juanita emerged again. Behind her came an elderly woman, deeply wrinkled but straight-backed, with shrewd eyes that took in the waiting men in a single glance. And holding the old woman's hand was a small figure that made Mason's heart stop for a moment. She was tiny, smaller than Mason would have expected for a 2-year-old, though he was hardly an expert on children's growth. Her hair was indeed the color of dry grass, falling in soft waves to her shoulders. Her skin was a warm golden tone, lighter than Juanita's, but darker than Elliot's sun-bronzed complexion. She wore a simple dress of soft deerskin decorated with beadwork around the edges. But it was her face that captured Mason's attention completely. The shape of her eyes, their deep brown color, the set of her small mouth, all were unmistakably Anna's, at least as Mason imagined Anna must have looked based on Juanita's descriptions. Yet there was something in the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, that was purely Elliot. And when she looked up at the strangers with a mixture of curiosity and shyness, Mason saw his son's expression mirrored in miniature. Beside him, Elliot made a small strangled sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. His body had gone rigid, his eyes fixed on the child, as if nothing else in the world existed. Nitika, Juanita said gently to the little girl, these men have come a long way to meet you. They are friends. The child regarded them solemnly, still holding the old woman's hand. Then, with the mercurial mood shift of the very young, she smiled a sudden, brilliant expression that transformed her face and sent an arrow of recognition straight through Mason's heart. It was Elliot's smile, exactly as it had been when he was a boy before grief and imprisonment had shadowed it. Elliot sank slowly to one knee, bringing himself to the child's level. His hands trembled at his sides as if he longed to reach out, but feared doing so. "Hello, Nitika," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Elliot." The little girl studied him with her mother's dark eyes. "Yut," she repeated carefully. "That's right." Elliot encouraged his smile, breaking through despite the tears that had begun to track down his cheeks. "Elliot." Nitika looked up at the old woman still holding her hand, seeking reassurance. The woman nodded slightly, her expression softening. Released from her caution, Nitika took a small step forward, her natural childish curiosity overcoming her initial reserve. "Why cry?" she asked, pointing at Elliot's wet cheeks. Elliot wiped hastily at his face. "Because I'm happy," he explained. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're very, very happy. Nitika considered this peculiar adult behavior with the serious contemplation of a child encountering a new concept. "Happy," she repeated, as if testing the word against his tears and finding the combination strange but acceptable. Mason watched the interaction with a tightness in his chest that was both painful and sweet. The gulf between Elliot and his daughter seemed simultaneously vast and paper-thin strangers by circumstance, yet connected by a bond deeper than knowledge or memory. Juanita moved to stand beside Mason, her voice low. "It will take time," she observed, "for both of them. The heart knows what the mind must learn slowly." Mason nodded, understanding her wisdom. Will your people allow us to stay, for a little while at least, so they can come to know each other?" Juanita's expression was unreadable. "That is not for me alone to decide. The council must speak on this. But for today and tonight, you are welcome as guests." It was more than Mason had dared hope for, given the history between their peoples. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For saving copper, for helping me reach Elliot in time, for keeping Dawn Nitika safe all this time." "I did not do these things for you," Juanita reminded him, though without rancor. "I did them for Anna, and for the child, and for the balance that was broken when Anna's life was taken." She looked toward Elliot, who was now showing Nitika a simple hand game, the little girl's initial wariness giving way to delighted giggles. "But perhaps, in restoring one balance, we create the possibility of a greater harmony. This remains to be seen." Throughout the afternoon, Elliot spent time with his daughter, carefully following the lead of the women who had raised her, respecting their routines and rules, while gradually earning Nitika's trust. Mason watched with pride and a touch of envy, remembering his own failings as a father. How often he had been absent during Elliot's childhood, how rarely he had engaged in the simple play he now witnessed between his son and granddaughter. Toward evening, as the camp prepared for the night meal, Mason sought out Copper. The gelding was tethered near the other horses, his injured leg wrapped in fresh bandages. At Mason's approach, he lifted his head and nickered softly in recognition. "Hello, old friend," Mason said, stroking the horse's neck. "Looks like you're on the mend." "He heals well," came Juanita's voice from behind him. "The flesh remembers its proper shape, given time, and the right medicine." Mason turned to find her watching him, her expression thoughtful. "Like people," he suggested. "Given time and the right circumstances, we can heal too." "Some wounds, yes," she agreed. "Others leave scars that never fade." Her gaze drifted toward where Elliot sat with Nitika on his lap, the little girl drowsy with approaching sleep. "Your son carries such scars, as does the child, though she does not yet know it." "What will happen to them now?" Mason asked the question that had been troubling him all afternoon, finally finding voice. "Elliot is free, but he has nothing, no home, no work. And Nitika, she belongs here with the people who have raised her, but she's his daughter." Juanita was silent for a long moment, her weathered face giving away nothing of her thoughts. "There are no easy answers," she said finally. "The white world would not welcome her. The Navajo world is not his. They are caught between, like so many children, of two bloods." She looked at Mason directly, her dark eyes penetrating. "You made a vow to acknowledge the child as your blood, regardless of the cost. Are you prepared to keep that vow, knowing what it might mean?" "I am," Mason said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Juanita nodded, seemingly satisfied with his sincerity. then perhaps there is a way forward, though it will not be easy for any of you." Before she could elaborate, a call came from the central fire. The evening meal was ready. Mason followed Juanita back to the heart of the camp where the small band had gathered around the fire. Elliot was already there, Nitika still on his lap. Her head nodded against his chest, in the boneless sleep of the very young. The elderly woman who had first brought Nitika out, Juanita's mother-in-law Mason, had gestured for Elliot to hand the child to her. He did so with obvious reluctance, carefully transferring the sleeping girl into the old woman's arms. "She will put her to bed," Juanita explained. "Join us for the meal. There is much to discuss." The food was simple but nourishing, a stew of rabbit and wild roots served with flat bread that reminded Mason of the tortillas he'd eaten in border towns. As they ate using wooden bowls and their fingers, Mason was acutely aware of the strangeness of the situation. Two white men being fed by the people they had been taught to consider enemies, sharing a meal as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After they had eaten, the men of the camp, who had been noticeably absent until now, appeared from whatever duties had kept them away. There were 5 of them, ranging from a youth barely old enough to be considered a man to an elder whose face was as deeply lined as Juanita's. They took their places around the fire, nodding to the visitors with reserved courtesy, but making no move to speak. Juanita addressed them in Navajo, a flowing stream of syllables that Mason couldn't understand, but found oddly musical. She spoke for several minutes, occasionally gesturing toward Mason and Elliot. The men listened attentively, their expressions revealing little of their thoughts. When she finished, the eldest of the men responded, his voice deep and deliberate. Though Mason couldn't understand the words, the tone suggested questions, perhaps concerns. Juanita answered at length, and gradually a discussion developed among the group, with various members contributing. Through it all, Mason and Elliot sat silently, knowing that their future and Nitika's was being decided. Finally, the elder turned to address them directly, speaking in accented but clear English. "Juanita has told us of your journey," he said to Mason, "and of the promise you made concerning the child. She has also told us of your son's innocence in Anna Whitefeather's death, and of the true killer's crimes." He paused, his gaze shifting to Elliot. "You loved Anna," he stated. "This is why the captain killed her, because she carried your child, a mixing of blood he could not accept." Elliot nodded, his expression solemn. "I loved her," he confirmed her. "We planned to marry, to leave this territory for somewhere we could live in peace. If I had known she was carrying our child," his voice faltered, "I would never have left her vulnerable. I would have taken her away immediately." The elder studied him as if weighing the truth of his words. "And now, what are your intentions toward the child?" "I want to be her father," Elliot said without hesitation, "in every way that matters. I want to know her and for her to know me. I want to protect her and provide for her. I want to honor Anna's memory by raising our daughter with love and respect for both sides of her heritage." The elder nodded slowly, then turned back to Mason. "And you, old one, you have made a sacred vow to acknowledge this child as your blood. What does this mean to you?" Mason took a deep breath, aware that his answer would be judged not just on its content, but on its sincerity. "It means that Dawn Nitika is my granddaughter," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "It means that I will treat her with the same love and care I would give to any child of my blood. It means that I will defend her right to exist between two worlds and help her find her place within them." The elder exchanged glances with Juanita, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he spoke again, addressing both Mason and Elliot. "The council has decided," he announced. "The child Nitika who is also called Dawn, belongs to both worlds, Navajo and White. She has been raised in our ways for 2 years, and these ways are now part of her spirit. But the blood of her father also calls to her, and this cannot be denied." He paused, looking around the circle where the other Navajo men nodded in agreement. "Therefore, we propose this: the child will continue to live with us with her Navajo family during the growing seasons. But in the winter months, when we move to the sheltered valleys, she may live with her father and grandfather to learn their ways and know that side of her heritage." Mason felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. The arrangement was more generous than he had dared expect, but it presented practical challenges. "Where would we live?" he asked. "Our ranch is gone, and Elliot has no home to offer her." "This is your problem to solve," the elder said bluntly. "But it must be solved if you wish this arrangement to begin. The child needs stability, not wandering." Elliot leaned forward, his expression intent. "What if we stayed near your winter camps? Built a small homestead within riding distance. That way Nitika wouldn't be completely separated from the people she knows, even when she's with us." The elder considered this, then looked to Juanita. She nodded slightly. "It could work," she said. "If you choose the right location, one that respects our boundaries, but allows the child to move between worlds without too much strain." "There's good land near Butterfly Creek," Mason suggested, recalling a valley he had passed through years ago on cavalry patrol. "Water year-round, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. It's within a day's ride of where the Navajo winter camps are usually established, if I remember correctly." Juanita's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know our winter locations well for a white man." "I served with the cavalry for many years," Mason admitted. "I was never involved in any actions against your people. But yes, I knew the territory." There was a moment of tension as this reminder of Mason's military past hung in the air. Then Juanita nodded slowly. "Butterfly Creek would be acceptable," she said. "It is close enough for the child to maintain her ties to our people, yet separate enough to respect our boundaries." The elder spoke again. "There is another condition," he said, his tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. "The child must continue her education in our ways even during her time with you. She must learn our stories, our ceremonies, our language. She must know who she is in the fullness of her heritage." "Agreed," Elliot said immediately. "I would want that for her in any case. Anna was proud of her heritage, and I want Nitika to feel that same pride." "And she must be protected," the elder continued. "There are those among the white settlers who would not look kindly on a mixed-blood child or on the men who claim her as family. You must be prepared to defend her against such prejudice." "With my life," Elliot promised, his expression fierce. Mason nodded in agreement, his hand unconsciously moving to the revolver at his hip. The elder studied them both for a long moment, then turned to confer briefly with the other men of the council. When he faced Mason and Elliot again, his expression had softened slightly. "It is decided, then," he announced. "You may begin to build your homestead at Butterfly Creek when the moon is full again. Before the first snow falls, you must have a proper shelter ready to receive the child. Until then, she remains with us. You may visit to continue building your bond with her, but always with respect for our ways and our guidance." It was more than either Mason or Elliot had dared hope for: a clear path forward, a chance to be part of Nitika's life while honoring her Navajo heritage. Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was released. "Thank you," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for caring for her when I couldn't, for keeping her safe, for giving me this chance to know her." The elder acknowledged his gratitude with a slight nod. "It is what Anna would have wanted," he said simply. And it is what the child deserves to know all of who she is, not just the parts that fit easily into one world or another. With that, the formal council seemed to conclude. The men rose, some drifting away to their own dwellings, others remaining by the fire to talk among themselves. Juanita approached Mason and Elliot, her expression thoughtful. "You should rest now," she advised. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. You may sleep in the guest lodge." She gestured toward a small structure at the edge of the camp. "It is prepared for you." As they walked toward the indicated dwelling, Mason felt a sense of unreality wash over him. Just 3 days ago, he had been riding through the desert with Copper, the pardon secured, but Elliot's freedom still uncertain. Now his son was beside him, free and reconciled with a daughter he hadn't known existed until yesterday. And Mason himself had been accepted, however conditionally, by the very people he had once considered adversaries. The guest lodge was simple but comfortable, with sleeping mats laid on a floor covered with woven blankets. As they settled down for the night, Elliot turned to his father, his expression a mixture of wonder and trepidation. "Can we really do this, Pa?" he asked quietly. "Build a homestead, raise a child, bridge these two worlds?" Mason considered the question seriously. At 63, he was well past the age when most men undertook such ambitious new beginnings, and Elliot, despite his youth, had been deeply marked by his time in prison. They had no money, no land, and precious few allies in a territory that would look askance at their unconventional family. But they had something that hadn't existed 3 days ago: hope. A reason to build something new from the ashes of their old lives. "We can," Mason said firmly. "It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But we have skills, experience. We know ranching, farming. We can build with our hands. And most importantly, we have Nitika to consider. That gives us a purpose greater than ourselves." Elliot was silent for a moment, absorbing his father's words. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that echoed the one Mason had seen on Nitika's small face earlier that day. "You've changed, Pa," he observed. "I don't think the Mason Riley I knew 2 years ago would have embraced a half-Navajo granddaughter so readily, or agreed to build a life that bridges two cultures." Mason nodded, acknowledging the truth in his son's observation. "I've had to confront a lot of things I thought I knew," he admitted. "About the Navajo, about what makes a family, about myself." He paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to see what really matters." "And what matters?" Elliot asked. Mason thought of Nitika's smile, of the way she had trustingly fallen asleep in Elliot's arms, despite having just met him. He thought of Juanita's wisdom and courage in saving the child, in helping him reach Fort Benson in time. He thought of Copper's loyalty, and of Ellen, gone now for so many years, but still a presence in his heart. "Love," he said simply. "Not the easy kind that comes when everything aligns with our expectations. The harder kind that asks us to see beyond what we thought we knew, to recognize the humanity in those different from ourselves. The kind that builds bridges instead of walls." Elliot reached out in the dimness, finding his father's hand and gripping it briefly. No words were necessary. The gesture conveyed all that needed to be said between them. They slept deeply that night, the exhaustion of their journey finally claiming them. Mason's dreams were peaceful for the first time in years, untroubled by the ghosts of past failures or fears for the future. Morning came with the soft sounds of the camp stirring to life. Voices calling quietly, the crackling of freshly built fires, the neighing of horses being tended. Mason woke feeling refreshed, his body still aching from the extraordinary journey, but his spirit lighter than it had been in memory. Elliot was already up, standing at the entrance to their lodge, watching the activity outside with keen interest. He turned as Mason stirred, and there was a new confidence in his bearing, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "She's awake," he said with barely contained excitement. "I saw her with the old woman Casa's mother-in-law. They're preparing the morning meal." Mason joined him at the doorway, following his gaze to where Nitika sat, near one of the cooking fires, solemnly helping the elderly woman grind something in a stone mortar. Even in this simple domestic task, the child's concentration and dexterity were remarkable for one so young. "She's a quick learner," came Juanita's voice from behind them. "Like her mother." They turned to find the Navajo woman watching them, her expression as composed as ever, but with a hint of warmth in her dark eyes. "Will you join us for the morning meal?" she invited. "Afterward, there is something I wish to show you, both of you." They followed her to the central fire where several of the camp's residents were already gathered. Nitika looked up as they approached, her serious expression breaking into a smile of recognition when she saw Elliot. "Yut," she called, abandoning her task to run to him with the impulsive enthusiasm of the very young. Elliot knelt to receive her, his face transformed by joy, as the little girl threw her arms around his neck in an uninhibited hug. Over her small shoulder, his eyes met Mason's, filled with wonder and gratitude. The morning meal was simple but satisfying, a porridge of grains and dried berries accompanied by the same flat bread from the previous evening. Nitika sat between Elliot and the old woman, who was clearly one of her primary caretakers, occasionally glancing up at her father with shy curiosity that was gradually giving way to comfortable acceptance. After the meal, Juanita beckoned for Mason and Elliot to follow her. To Mason's surprise, she led them not toward the center of the camp, but away from it up a narrow trail that wound into the hills. Nitika accompanied them, holding Elliot's hand, and chattering in a mixture of Navajo and broken English about the plants and animals they passed. The climb was not difficult, but Mason found himself breathing harder than he would have liked, a reminder of his age and the exertions of the past days. Elliot noticed his father's labored breathing and slowed his pace, allowing Mason to set a more comfortable rhythm. After about 20 minutes, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, Mason could see the Navajo camp below, the thin threads of smoke rising from cooking fires, the horses grazing in their makeshift corral. Beyond the camp, the desert stretched away, its harsh beauty, softened by the morning light. Juanita led them to a pile of stones arranged in a circular pattern near the edge of the plateau. Within the circle stood a simple wooden cross, weathered by exposure, but clearly maintained with fresh wildflowers laid at its base. "Anna," Juanita said, simply gesturing toward the cross. Elliot stopped abruptly, his body going rigid with emotion. Nitika, sensing the change in him, looked up with concern, then followed his gaze to the stone circle. "Mama," she said softly, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who has been taught to associate a place with a concept she cannot fully comprehend. Elliot sank to his knees beside the grave, tears streaming unchecked down his face. Nitika, uncertain but instinctively compassionate, patted his arm with her small hand. "Happy crying?" she asked, remembering his explanation from the day before. Elliot shook his head. "Sad crying," he managed to say, "because I missed your mama so much, and I never got to say goodbye." Nitika considered this seriously, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small, smooth stone. She placed it carefully on the grave, then looked up at Elliot. "Goodbye, stone," she explained with the solemn conviction of one sharing important wisdom. "Mama here." The simple gesture, delivered with such childish certainty, seemed to break something open in Elliot. He gathered Nitika into his arms, holding her close as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. The little girl allowed herself to be held, patting his back with instinctive comfort. Mason stood back, giving his son space for this private grief. Juanita moved to stand beside him, her expression thoughtful as she watched the scene. "The cross was Anna's choice," she said quietly. "She found faith in the white man's God during her time working at the fort, though she never abandoned our ways. We honored her wishes, though some of the elders did not approve." Mason nodded, understanding the compromise this represented. "Thank you for bringing us here," he said. "For Elliot, especially. He needed this." "All souls need closure," Juanita observed. "Even those who live on must find a way to say goodbye to those who have departed." They stood in silence for a time, watching as Elliot's grief gradually subsided. He remained kneeling, one arm around Nitika, the other hand resting on the wooden cross, as if maintaining contact with both his past and his future. Finally, Elliot rose, lifting Nitika into his arms. His face was tear-streaked, but composed, his eyes reflecting a peace that hadn't been there before. "I'll take care of her," he promised softly, whether to the cross to Juanita or to some presence only he could sense. Mason couldn't tell. "I'll make sure she knows who her mother was, how brave and beautiful and kind. I'll make sure she's proud of both sides of her heritage." Juanita nodded satisfaction in her expression. "This is why I brought you here," she said. "So that your promise would be made not just to us, the living, but to her as well." As they descended from the plateau, Mason found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Not just the physical journey across the desert, extraordinary as that had been, but the longer, more complex journey of heart and mind that had led him from rigid prejudice to this new understanding. He thought of Ellen gone these 15 years and wondered what she would make of these developments. Would she have embraced Nitika as readily as he now found himself doing? He liked to think she would have. Ellen had always had a gentler heart, a more flexible mind. Perhaps she would have helped him reach this point sooner, had she lived. Back at the camp, the day unfolded in a rhythm dictated by the needs of the community. Mason and Elliot were included in the activities as guests respected, but still observers rather than participants in the daily life of the Navajo band. They spent time with Nitika, building the fragile beginnings of a relationship that would need months, perhaps years, to fully develop. By evening, as they gathered once more around the central fire, Mason found himself thinking of the future with a cautious optimism he had not felt in years. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. Building a homestead from nothing, creating a life that bridged two worlds, protecting Nitika from those who would judge her for her mixed heritage. None of these tasks would be easy. But for the first time since Ellen's death, perhaps even since the war that had marked him so deeply, Mason felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. There was something to build now, something to nurture and protect. A legacy that went beyond the bitterness and loss that had shaped so much of his life. As if sensing his thoughts, Juanita came to sit beside him, her gaze on Elliot and Nitika, who were engaged in a simple game involving pebbles and a pattern drawn in the dust. "Your son is good with her," she observed. "He has patience." "He gets that from his mother," Mason replied with a small smile. "I've never been known for patience." "Yet you persevered for 2 years to free him," Juanita pointed out. "That requires a different kind of patience, the kind that endures rather than waits quietly." Mason considered this distinction, finding truth in it. "I suppose so," he acknowledged, "though I nearly failed at the end. If not for you and your medicine and those moccasins—" He gestured to his feet, where he still wore the beaded footwear that had carried him so impossibly far. Juanita studied the moccasins with a slight smile. "They were my husband's, as I told you. He was a white man, though few remember that now. A trapper who came to our lands, fell in love, and chose to stay. His feet walked both worlds as yours now must." Mason looked at her in surprise. Your husband was white. You never mentioned that before. It was not relevant before, she said simply. Now, perhaps it is. A reminder that what you and Elliot face with Nitika is not without precedent. Others have built lives between worlds. Was it difficult? Mason asked, genuinely curious. Being married to someone from such a different background, Juanita's expression grew distant, remembering.
Yes, she admitted. There were those among my people who never accepted him, who saw him always as an outsider.
And there were white men who called him traitor, who threatened him for taking a Navajo wife. We lived apart from both societies for many years. She turned her gaze back to Nitika, a softness entering her expression. But from that difficulty came strength. Our children knew both worlds, spoke both languages, understood both ways of thinking. They could move between societies that saw each other only as enemies. Like Nitika will, Mason said. Yes, Juanita agreed. Though her path will have its own challenges. The world changes, but some prejudices remain constant. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the fire and the people gathered around it. Then Juanita spoke again, her voice thoughtful. When you build your homestead at Butterfly Creek, she said, remember that you are not just building a house, you are building a bridge, a place where two worlds can meet without conflict. This is a sacred task, though your people might not see it as such. I'm beginning to understand that, Mason replied, and I promise you, we'll honor the responsibility. Juanita nodded, satisfied with his response. Then I believe Anna's spirit will rest easier, she said, and Nitika will have the chance to become all that she is meant to be, not half of one world or half of another, but wholly herself, a child of both. As the fire burned lower and the stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Mason felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. The journey that had begun in desperate haste was ending in unexpected peace. The pardon that had seemed so urgently important now felt like merely one step in a much longer, more meaningful journey. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, planning for the homestead, arranging for supplies, beginning the practical work of creating a life for Elliot and Nitika. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, Mason allowed himself to simply be grateful. For his son's freedom, for his granddaughter's existence, for the wisdom of an old woman who had seen beyond boundaries of race and history to the deeper truths that connected them all. As Elliot carried a sleeping Nitika to her bed in the lodge, she shared with her caretakers, Mason looked up at the star-filled sky. Somewhere in that vastness, he liked to think Ellen was watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was smiling at how far he had come, at the family that was being forged from loss and love and courage. We'll be all right, he whispered to the stars, to Ellen's memory, to himself. All of us, together. And for the first time in more years than he could remember, Mason Riley believed those words with his whole heart.